It's a real pleasure to welcome Jacob Chase to the Caring CEO. Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks, Graham. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jacob, what does care in the workplace mean to you?
Yeah, to me, there's kind of two dimensions to it, right? Where the individual, each person has to care about their contribution that they're making in the workplace, but the workplace has to reciprocate that as well with an alignment, so to speak, of kind of preserving the interest of the organization as well as with the individual. I think that's really what it all comes down to for me.
Yeah, fantastic. And just for our listeners, you've had a interesting career in three parts sort of thing. Would you mind just giving them a bit more background about, where you came from and where you are now
Yeah,
in terms of the work you do?
yeah, absolutely. So I'm out of Denver. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. I went to school out here. And my first kind of career stint was on Wall Street, where I started a couple years in investment banking and then worked at a top hedge fund for a number of years as well. That actually wound up taking me around the world and seeing some interesting places along with the finance work we were doing. Towards the end of that, me and a buddy started buying some real estate back in Denver. And that turned into kind of a side hustle that grew up and brought me off of Wall Street, brought me back to Denver. And me and a partner built a diversified real estate platform. And, that was back in 2017 when we started. And, ultimately we had kind of a traditional private equity type real estate business and then several other ancillary service companies to support those investments, as well as support third parties. And that was a great run. Running that business, we had 150 people. It was really when I started, thinking through the lens of how do you really take care of a workforce? How do you really align people with the work that the company needs and the work that is going to bring them kind of the personal satisfaction and career development? And we sold out of the business in 2023, which led to my current venture, which is a company called the INFIN, which we help to decentralize assessment in the workplace in a way that allows the individual contribution to team outcomes to be measurable and provide them the feedback of what is valued from the team around them for base of their contribution and how is it actually aligning with business success. And so that's the work that I'm doing now, which really stemmed from an executive position in the real estate business over managing a lot of people that you really want to give your best to and get the best from, and really trying to put some more measurable dynamics around how you actually do that.
Yeah, I really want to go into that, but just jump back now to Wall Street and the work you're
Yeah.
doing there. I'm sure it was very much about numbers. What was the area you specialized in, and what did you learn during your period there?
So my first job was as a restructuring investment banker at a firm called Lazard. And this was during the height of the financial crisis. And, I was a non-target contributor to that team, but it was the best first job I could have ever imagined. It was, I'm working on deals in the boardroom that I'm reading about on the front page of the Wall Street Journal the next day, and just getting an incredible crash course in financial analytics, in, high expectations for, work performance and learning, real detail orientation about what quality work actually looks like. And so I took a ton from that first 2 years, which then kind of rolled into the hedge fund position, which was focused on distressed credit investing, where, a lot of companies take loans that they can't necessarily repay. And what do you do in those situations? How do you, make money on behalf of your investors? And we were a very collaborative firm that would try to partner with companies and management teams in order to manage their debt loads while obviously generating returns for ourselves at the same time. And so there was a tremendous kind of scope of the type of businesses that we were exposed to, where we were all generalists. We didn't have specific industry focused. We just got a really good exposure to the world of business, all of the different types and formats and structures that work and don't work. And I really took a lot away from that in how kind of the economy works and how it's driven by companies, which are ultimately driven by the people who are working there.
Yeah, and you mentioned just a moment ago that it was a very collaborative team. And that doesn't always happen in any workplace. It can be competitive. I win, you lose. Who was it that really contributed to that collaborative environment? Was there a particular leader that made that happen, and what did they do?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the company's founders, a gentleman named Michael Gordon, was, big on reputation. And, we wanted a reputation as a partner in difficult situations where we
Mm,
could be reliable and trustworthy, and obviously with our own self-interest, but it really kind of demonstrated the alignment that was required for successful outcomes.
yeah.
And, I think him helping to manage the firm's reputation made sure that we were only involved in situations where we could act accordingly. And I think that had a
Mm,
big impact on me.
yeah. And what did he do to enhance that reputation? I guess delivering good deals where everyone's happy is obviously a pretty good place to start. But was there anything else that he did that really provided, I guess, a roadmap of the culture that produced good results?
I mean, I think in large part it came from more of a governance perspective of which deals were selected for and what were the dynamics of the situation and the stands that we were going to have to take as an institution, and were they aligned with what we wanted to promote? And I think through those actions, you quickly learn, as a member of the squad to make sure that you're aligned. And I think
Yeah,
that
yeah,
those demonstrations were probably what reinforced that more than anything else.
yeah. I recently interviewed Alex Liu, and he was the global managing partner and chairman of Carney, a management consulting company. And it's interesting. He was at the end of his career, but he was saying that, what he really learned was that there's, three things clients look for. It's competence, feeling confident you can do it, confidence that, you'll make it happen. And the third element for him was care. And after reflecting on 50 years of business, he felt the care component was what won or lost it, because there were lots of other competent ones there. And I guess that comes back to, your boss having a great reputation, and that great reputation probably does indicate that, you cared about the work you did and cared about the results you delivered.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me a little bit of a Warren Buffett quote where when you're looking for people, you want, competence, you want energy, and you want good morals. Because if
Yeah,
you only have two of the three, the lack of the third is always going to kill you. And I think
definitely.
there's some wisdom in that.
Going from that, where you've got a big firm, lots of support around you, to then deciding to start your own business in real estate, what was
Yeah.
that first sort of 6 months like?
Well, look, it was interesting to leave Wall Street, right? Where there was not a path that was well trodden. Most people were kind of very happy with their situation, and I was too. But there was always kind of an internal desire to, go figure it out on my own to some degree, and a
Yeah,
willingness for the trial by fire, and I think a little bit more of a risk appetite too. Not in the sense of like, investing capital in risky ways, but in a sense of taking some personal risk, allowing things to be dynamic. The early days they were hard, right? We had, there was a very small number of us. We built the team over time. It was acquiring properties and learning how to manage them and build the team to do so as we went. And then also soliciting third-party business. It's like we had these services that we needed to kind of augment outside of our own portfolios. And it was a lot of kind of early learning,
mm,
a lot of the, I think, pressure dynamics of Wall Street, where it was very much a perform to expectations type environment, just didn't translate well when I was managing the small team early on. And, there was a lot of adaptation required for my own leadership to, align with the reality of kind of the folks I'm working with, their interests and skill sets, and learn how to adapt myself. I think was probably some of the hardest early stuff that I had to learn.
yeah. So what sort of changes did you make, when you realized that your leadership wasn't quite right and you had to do things a bit differently?
I mean, I think one was recognizing that the independence that was largely granted on Wall Street, because of the expectations of, you just do your job and perform, didn't translate as well, and that people needed more attention towards progressing the work. And, I think understanding that probably took me longer than I should have. But there was a lot more of a kind of a coaching aspect, a lot more of an accountability aspect that I wasn't used to and what didn't come naturally to me. But it was very clearly demanded by our team and the folks that we're working with. And
Yeah.
that, I was the one who's going to have to change in order to, have a successful outcome.
And what changes did you make?
I mean, I think one of tone was a big one. That was one that, being too harsh or being too demanding or being too authoritarian to a certain degree really had to change. And learning how to collaborate, understand where people are, what they need to be successful, and being more, I think, empathetic to that situation, required a lot of change in communication style, in kind of structure, in, simple things like meeting cadence and agendas and, helping people be successful by being prepared based on these couple things. And that went a long ways
Yeah.
to helping us gain momentum.
Yeah. It's quite a different thing to have a company which has got 5 people up to 150. With I guess the last couple of years, how did you keep your finger on the pulse of what was happening across 150 people?
Yeah, look, it was a challenge. And, we had 6 individual businesses, each with, various capabilities of leadership within them. And, we had to understand where could we be more hands off? Where did we have to be more hands on? And, as the company grew, it became less and less practical to be more and more hands on. And
Mm.
so, we wanted to figure out like, how do you really, you know, understand who your contributors are, put in kind of a typical HR review process, and that still, I think, wasn't largely that meaningful, both for the participants and for the organization, and
Mm.
really looked to really what I'm doing now to help try to solve some of those issues.
How did you go about, I guess, identifying the key people in your business, the ones that made a big difference, a considerable bit a difference to the success of the company?
Well, as the company grew, the key people were well known. When we're at 50 people, you know who everyone is, you know who the go-to people are, you know exactly the workload that they're carrying and the dependencies each team has on them. And it was really kind of when we get to that 120 or 150 person size where you start to lose touch with that, where,
Yeah.
I was no longer hiring everyone personally and didn't have, and people were joining the company that I'd never met before and didn't have any visibility into their roles or contribution or very limited visibility. And so ultimately, we tried, the 9 boxing and the kind of the manager directed evaluations, and they still kind of left, a little bit of bad taste in my mouth. And we had high participation, and people, I think, genuinely appreciate feedback in a structured way. But it didn't kind of connect the dots between the alignment of the organization and the alignment of the individual in a way that I felt was needed. And
Mm.
there's kind of one specific example that stands out in my mind where we had an accounts payable person. And this gentleman, was a rock star, like best accounts payable specialist you can imagine, like way above and beyond his job description, a cultural torchbearer, was, highly depended upon by a lot of different people. And, really just set an example for, the type of service that we wanted to extend to each other across the organization.
Mm.
But in the normal review system, it just wasn't recognized the impact he was making.
Sorry, I've just got to pause. I think my cleaner's just arrived. Sorry about this. Was there anyone in the business that had a big impact, which was surprising?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one very specific incident or not incident, but individual that stood out in my mind where we had an accounts payable person, and they were a junior person, low on the totem pole, so to speak, but they were truly a rock star. They were an absolute outperformer in every sense of the word. He took a tremendous initiative, was a cultural flag bearer in the way that, we really embraced way above and beyond their job description, handling IT issues and vendor issues and all sorts of things way beyond traditionally processing invoices. And I'm looking at this person, and the job market says they're valued at $55,000 a year. But it was very clear to me that they were worth way more to the organization than what their salary band implied. And so I was really interested in figuring out, how do I actually measure the contribution of this individual in a way that rewards them for the extra contribution that they're making above and beyond what is, kind of initially required.
And how did you go about doing that? Were you able to address it in the right way, in the right manner?
I think so. I think so. And so there was a couple of fundamental assumptions that we had to challenge, or that, that I personally had to challenge in order to kind of come up with a way to do it. And the first one was challenging the idea of a centralized review process, where in our traditional program, it was manager driven, and here's the 10 criteria, and each person is rated 1 to 10. It didn't really surface, with the things that were important. And what we ended up doing was embracing much more of a decentralized sense of judgment, where, each person has their own perspective of what's valuable in their daily interactions. And simply by requiring everyone to use this lens that was, produced by our team, removed a lot of our ability to see into that. But when people are given, their own ability to judge what's valuable around them, you can end up getting some system level intelligence that is really important and really useful. And so, one other important kind of addition to that is, there's a limited amount of value that can be distributed amongst everybody on the team. The performance of the organization matters in kind of establishing how big the pie is. But then the decentralized view of, contribution, I think, can calculate each person's slice in a very objective way that, really matters for how we reward contribution in the workplace.
Yeah. And this led to, once you sold the business, it was a very successful business, starting your new company. And how would you describe your unique product offering that you provide to your clients?
So at its essence, what we provide is a proportionate share of contribution. So if you have a team of 10 or a company of 1,000, we can actually help you calculate the percentage contribution that each person is making out of the whole. And with that information, you can then do interesting things like evaluate how much each person should be paid based on the contribution they're bringing, which is again judged by everyone that they're working with. But the way that we gather that information is through an ongoing feedback loop of each person inputting information about the people that they're working with, the things that are going well, the things that are not. And in doing so, they also receive information from everyone else they've been working with about what they're doing well and what they're not. And so we've really tightened the feedback loops and created kind of a live view of, of an individual's contribution that I think has a lot of knock-on effects that are very valuable both for the individual and for the organization.
And what is the feedback anonymous?
It is. All of the inputs are anonymous.
Yeah.
And so, we go to a great length to protect confidentiality of input information.
Yeah. And, there must be situations where there's a huge diversity of opinion, where someone thinks they're doing a great job, but someone thinks they're not. What do you do in that situation, I guess, to highlight there's an issue there and it's not working as well as it could?
Well, so we can obviously understand where there's a divergence of opinion, but another kind of analogy that I think makes sense to make is it's the stock market. Like at my core, I'm still a finance guy. And the stock market is the amalgamation of a huge set of diverse opinions in
Yeah.
order to produce an answer.
Yeah.
And you have, in finance terms, you've got your day traders and your value investors and your quant investors and your short sellers and all types of different people who are contributing to the view of the market.
Yeah.
And our kind of our system helps to aggregate the diversity of views in a way that allows for effectively, a price that is the collective judgment of everybody for each
Mm,
individual. And so
mm,
those divergent views get weighed accordingly in the market system.
yeah. And can you provide an example of a client that you've helped and served in terms of how you came to meet them, how you presented, and I guess how you got them over the line and the implementation? I think that might help our listeners understand more of the specifics.
Yeah. And so a recent client that we've worked with is a large construction company. We started with an implementation with their executive team. There was a team of 10. And, because they wanted to get a feel for the experience of both the feedback loops that they're going to receive about themselves and the obligation of providing information about everyone else. And, it was built in a way, or it is built in a way that, a couple minutes a day on each person or by each person inputting information keeps the system, keeps the market liquid enough so that you have really good data. And each person just in that short experience with the executive team learned things about themselves that they hadn't heard before, and very important and valuable information. And it was fascinating because it came about a week after their formal review process. And people learned a lot more than just what was provided in the formal review. And, from there, several of the team members implemented it on their teams. And, and it continues to cascade throughout the organization based on an interest and a willingness to participate. And so there's no mandate of participation, but we've found that there's a lot of interest when people start learning things that they're not getting elsewhere, that they find highly credible, and they have the data to reinforce the behavior change that their teams are seeking. And you can see your value increase as your behavior changes in a way that you just can't do with an annual review cycle. And so it's been a really successful test for this client, and they continue to use it regularly.
How does it differ from a, 360-degree feedback, something which is often used in leadership circles? What additional information would you get that you wouldn't get from something like that?
I think it goes back to the centralized assessment criteria versus the decentralized assessment criteria,
Mm.
where, when each individual has their own perspective of what is valuable, right? So, the CEO thinks that business performance is valuable, but, the new joiner fresh out of college thinks that, the boss that helps them get integrated, the
Mm.
team member who helps them socially interact or points them where to go throughout the organization and help them get adapted, that's valuable. And
Yeah,
so by allowing for all of those different perspectives, you just get a much richer sense of how your contribution is valued by others.
yeah.
And removing that limit of centralization makes a big difference in the feedback people are able to learn about themselves.
Do you find that there's a certain size company where you get into faster and have the biggest impact straight away? Or do you have experience with, the full range to, like a smaller organization right up to one with 5,000 people?
Yeah, I think that in smaller organizations, there's a familiarity that everyone has with everyone else that sometimes doesn't lead to the need. Whereas in larger organizations that are distributed or have lots of cross-functional teams in different regions and that kind of thing, the information is really important. And so, we've really had most of the success with kind of 100 to 2,000 size organizations of
Mhm,
individuals.
mhm.
And, I think that's kind of our sweet spot for the moment of where we're adding the most value. And yeah.
I mentioned before we started that, something similar to what you described happened in our airline, Australia's airline, Qantas, and they were looking at planning culture change. This happened a while ago, probably 10 years ago. And they're looking at finding champions in the business that could help with that culture change. And so they went through this process to understand who was respected, who got things done, who was capable of going across divisions and making things happen. And, the most valuable person turned out to be someone in a warehouse. None of the executive team were there, but he was just, his name was Elvis. And he just had this reputation of being able to get things done, being able to make things easier, being reliable, being trustworthy. And it was a key part of the culture change. And I guess with your business as well, across 1,000 people, you might identify 100 that could make the biggest impact because of the level of trust and respect they have.
Mhm.
Do you ever use a method to tack into that 100, for example, to help change the culture and get it in the direction that the leadership team wants it to go?
So we can certainly do kind of the network dependency analyses, right? Where, we think about it as a network, an organization as a network, and certain nodes within that network are more highly dependent upon than others. And that often translates into value for the organization and for the individual.
Mm.
But another way that we think about it a little bit is oftentimes those most highly trusted individuals or those most interconnected nodes are the ones that already have a service-oriented mindset, where they are the ones who are already going above and beyond to serve their teammates.
Mm.
And one thing with a kind of a centralized assessment platform is that there creates a little bit of a political incentive where there is a self-promotion incentive, maybe hold down some competition incentive in order to be recognized under that dynamic.
Mm.
But when you have a decentralized assessment system, the incentive then becomes to serve because everybody has say over everybody else. And
Mm.
what is rewarded, the way that you become valuable is by serving your team. And
Yeah.
so we really try to tap into that incentive structure of kind of a service-oriented mindset as becoming valuable and
Yeah.
helping to both create a direct incentive structure and a social incentive structure that are aligned with that tends to achieve best outcomes for the individual and the organization.
Yeah.
And I think in a very meaningful way.
It's interesting, isn't it, coming down to the service orientation or what has been called servant leadership. It's, a really interesting evolution from the old command and control
Sure.
environment that was there before. As we mentioned when I first started, I've just written a book called The Great Leaders Care. And there's a three-part mindset in that. One is about self-care, how we look after ourselves, crew care, creating that dynamic in the team, and then red zone care, being able to identify and support someone who's struggling. How do you practice self-care, Jacob? What do you do to make sure you keep fuel in your tank?
Yeah. I mean, I have, pretty dialed personal routines. Like I sleep really well every night, 8 hours. I don't drink. I work out heavily. I have good meal prep habits, so I'm always eating a good diet consistently. And, I think that gives me kind of the energy to make sure that I'm always in a good mind state to make my biggest contribution.
Yeah.
Have a great family dynamic and a good kind of support structure for when I'm struggling. And I think all those add up to, a really positive kind of self-care state that I'm in now for sure.
Yeah, and what you've described is fantastic. It's obviously, is that a recent thing, or have you done it your entire career, be really disciplined about your self-care?
I've been pretty disciplined for most of my life. I think that it's been adding new disciplines over time. But, in general, like I work in structure and, I'm disciplined about maintaining my structure because whenever I fall outside of it, the wheels tend to come off. And so, I've learned that one through the years.
Yeah, wonderful. And what about, good and supportive friends? Do you catch up with people on a regular basis? Is there discipline around that, or is it more just sort of a bit more laissez-faire?
There's less discipline around that, although I have explored kind of schedules of keeping in touch with people and that kind of thing. Nothing's been incorporated as a habit yet, but like I absolutely know the importance of making sure I'm checking in with folks maybe when they have a time of need and aren't taking, or aren't inclined to take the initiative to reach out. That's definitely one that's been on my mind. It's not official yet, but I recognize the need to be proactive in that for sure.
Yeah, I had a real mental health breakdown about 15 years ago, and it emerged from there that I'd often let relationships go, because I was focused on the work, getting things done. And, since then, and since that recovery, I've been very disciplined about having good people in my life and seeing them regularly. And, I'm now absolutely convinced that the quality of our relationships determine the quality of our life. It's, to have people that are there to support you, encourage you, joke with you, all that sort of stuff makes a big difference. The second element is crew care. And this is about how we promote team belonging, team connection, psychological safety, where people feel they can contribute and challenge ideas. And I guess also a bit of a growth mindset. We grow together. What sort of things do you try to put in place for your team, but also in the teams you consult with? Are there tangible actions that come from your analysis that help make that happen?
That's a deep question.
Sorry.
I think personally, and I may be taking some lessons from some of my previous leaders, is that I always try to demonstrate the behavior that I want to elicit from everyone.
Yeah.
And, one of those comes from, or an example is always being open to everything before, making any sort of shutdown motion or anything like that, where,
Yeah.
I really want to encourage kind of the dynamism and the idea generation and the creativity in the team that, even if it doesn't necessarily align with the current objectives and would be a distraction if we pursued, like I definitely saw in my real estate business, kind of shutting things down too early sets an example that you don't want. And I've been really careful to kind of foster the conversation around new ideas rather than, jump to an answer that I may already think I know. Because not just because you want to keep things efficient and organized, but because you want to foster an environment where those things are okay. Because,
Okay.
a lot of things, aren't going to be a hit, but
Yeah.
you never want to create a situation where you're going to miss one that would have been.
Yeah.
And that's one where I'm really cognizant of. And so, yeah, with that, I kind of lost the rest of the conversation.
You did really highlight not shutting down things too early, being open to new ideas. Collaboration is obviously a really big one. It's interesting. I often, in my keynotes, ask people to reflect on a great team they've been part of. It could be the current one, could be previous one, could be when they worked at McDonald's or played football or basketball or whatever. And ask people to really think about that team. Look at the faces of people that were part of that team and ask them to what made it different. And so I've got about 10 different factors there and ask them to nominate three. And, there's things like having a compelling vision, complementary strengths, good communication skills. But in 95% of the cases, the top three things that come up is that we cared about each other, we had each other's back, and we encouraged each other. And I think that just sort of reflects, a fundamental human need to feel that we belong, we're part of a tribe, part of a system, or a network, as you referred to it before. But those things have become more and more important as the world's got more complex. No one leader can have all the wisdom and answers, can they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of those dynamics thrive in the team that I'm currently on. And, there's a lot of ownership that each person is bringing, that they, all, I think, bring their best every day. Even when things don't work, then they're encouraged and supported in the right ways to, continue iterating and striving for what will work.
Yeah.
And, I think that we allow for the boundaries of independence in a way that's really important too, where, we have a diverse set of skills on our team. And, some people have kind of highlighted skills in very complementary ways, where I think you mentioned one of the criteria was kind of complementary skill sets. And I think we've got that in kind of a perfect balance right now.
Mm.
And, when you combine all of the kind of interpersonal intangibles with everyone working for a vision that they believe in and that they think matters and makes a difference and have their own kind of intrinsic motivation to see it succeed, that really kind of unlocks, I think, the next level of the team performance.
Yeah. And I really love the direction that your business has taken because, people always say measure what matters. And typically, that's sales expenses, profit, et
Right.
cetera, et cetera. But that's the after effect, isn't it? Measuring that is after the fact. And what you're talking about is measuring the service and contribution of the people today and next week and what have you. And I would suspect that would be a very good risk management strategy as well, being able to identify where there are dysfunctional things happening in a certain division or a certain area and being able to address it before you have large staff turnover and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was fascinating because, when we were at the real estate business and it really kind of rolled out our first prototype of this program, one of the first things that stood out were two kind of middle managers that were in the field away from headquarters that were underperforming. And we didn't know about it. And it stood out in the data. And, based on the assessment of everyone they were working with, there were problems. And, you go and, do a little digging and lo and behold, there was an intervention required. And,
Mm.
I think it really opened our eyes to the power of the decentralized, perspective in really highlighting the things that needed to change.
Yeah.
And, you have to couple that with the results of the organization to make sure that the prevailing opinion is linked to the outcomes of the collective.
Yeah.
And in order to kind of evaluate, what's a real problem versus what's not. But I think that that transparency kind of unlocks a whole new ability to not let problems get bigger. And it's an important one for business today.
Excellent. It's been fantastic catching up today, Jacob. I've really enjoyed our chat. I always finish with one question is that what advice would you give your 20-year-old self, knowing what you know now, all that you've gleaned in the last 30 odd years? What would you tell your 18-year-old self if you had the chance to pass on something important?
You know, I do pass on this advice to, college students when I'm speaking with them. And I think I got really lucky in it. It's, don't pick the job, pick the boss. It's like, who are you going to learn the most from? And, that's what's really going to accelerate you rather than a title or a pay package or some sort of glamour associated with it. And I think I got really lucky from that perspective. Probably chose the job for the wrong reasons, but got lucky with the right people I was working with and working for. And I would reinforce that what you learn working for the right people matters way more than anything else, especially early on in your career. And really would reinforce that one.
I really love that. Choose the boss, not the job. Let's see, you know, you'll learn a lot more, won't you, with the right boss compared to a bad boss.
Indeed.
Thanks for being part of a Caring CEO, Jacob. I really appreciate your time.
Graham, this was terrific. Thank you so much for having me on the show.